The last lecture of social and intellectual background of Victorian poetry, as I said at the end of the previous lecture, is Victorian Compromise. Now, what is a Victorian Compromise? And before that, we go on to read a small quote from Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. Now, obviously, this lecture is about Victorian poetry, but I think no other piece of literature describes this age of compromise, this Victorian compromise, better than Charles Dickens's this quote from Tale of Two Cities. It says that it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the season of hope and it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. So if you see this quote, it's the words are these small phrases are made up of entirely opposing contradictory elements. And like the best time, the worst of times, wisdom and foolishness, it's almost radical opposites of each other, contradicting each other. This whole paragraph in A Tale of Two Cities, the beginning of Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, are made of these contradictions which he introduces in the very beginning. Now, what then is the Victorian Compromise? Now, Victorian Age was also known as the age of contrast and contradiction, as you might have guessed from the previous quote. It was the age of double standards and hypocrisy. Now, these make up the Victorian Compromise. Of course, this term, the Victorian Compromise, wasn't given to themselves by the Victorian people. It was rather much later when Professor Lawrence M. Friedman termed this behavior as the social behavior or some social trait of this time as the Victorian Compromise in this book of his called Guarding Life, Dark Secrets, Legal and Social Controls over Reputation, Propriety and Privacy. Now, Professor Lawrence M. Friedman is a professor of law and historian from the United States. And much later in 1900 something, he wrote this book where he termed this phenomena as the Victorian Compromise. Now, as you can understand, of course, from the quote, what other elements of Victorian Compromise do we find? Now, of course, there were some very clear opposing forces that were present at the same time in Victorian society. Now, one was ethical conformism. Ethics, as you know, I have discussed about ethics and morality in Victorian in the lecture about Victorian morality. So, conforming to that standard of morality versus corruption of that morality, that was the two opposing forces existing at the same time. There was also moralism and philanthropy on one side and money versus capitalist greed on the other side that was simultaneously present in the Victorian society. And there was also this contradiction in private lives and public behaviors. Now, there were many, but let's start with these three and we move on in better details about the rest. Now, talking first about industrialization. Now, we have done a separate lecture on industrialization and we have already identified most of this. As you know, in any industrial period like this in the Victorian Britain, which was the height of industrialization that it reached, and it was the age of progress, it was the age of stability, it was an age of great social norms and reforms. But at the same time, I also discussed that it was characterized by poverty, injustice and social unrest. And two completely different things, the age of progress and at the same time this age of poverty and injustice. Stability versus injustice, progress versus poverty, two totally contradicting elements are there in Victorian society, coexisting at the same time, which makes up this idea of Victorian compromise. Now, on one hand, there was progress brought about by the Industrial Revolution and the rising wealth of the upper and the middle classes, which were extending their power to Britain and the large British Empire. On the other hand, there was widespread poverty because there was a great influx of population from the countryside to the metropolis of London, because the factories were set there, there was jobs, and these lower class people, which constituted of the 80%, about 80% of the British population during that time, stayed in close quarters without proper sanitation, without proper health, without proper wages, without proper food. So on one hand, England was becoming this industrial superpower, but at the same time, a huge section of British citizens were suffering abject poverty and health issues like diseases, outbreak, and deprivation and injustice, which were faced by this large working class. So both of these, on one hand, Britain becoming this superpower, and at the same time, this huge section of its own citizens suffering from these issues. So that was the contradiction and compromise in when it comes to industrialization. The next is about morality and respectability. Now, obviously, we have also discussed this in our previous lectures. Most of the points, in fact, let me tell you, most of the points we discussed here are already discussed in the previous 5 lectures that I've uploaded. But here we see that there is the contradiction happening between these Britain's own elements. Now, when it comes to morality and respectability, as you know, Victorian morality I have discussed. It was mainly middle class values, and they believed in strict conformity to these social standards, this ethics and moralities and values, which were mostly the middle class values. And respectability, which was a term very closely associated with morality, was the middle class, and this respectability, this sense of morality, which came from the middle class, also distinguished this middle class from the lower class. And morality also, this sense of holier than thou, this sense of high morality was only for the middle classes, and it was expected to believe that the lower class, they suffer from a lesser morality, they were not so moral and not so respectable as the middle and higher classes. Now, respectability, besides having this moral standards, also meant ownership of a comfortable house with servants and a carriage or a car, and regular attendance at church and some charity activity. Now, again, there is contradiction, because morality was something that didn't come from within. Morality was kind of a social construct. It was a set of rules that you had to conform to. It's not something that comes from within. Now, charity or philanthropy was a wide phenomena. You were expected to give alms to the poor and help the poor. And this rich middle class, on one hand, they were exploiting the poor very ruthlessly by giving them low wages and making them live in some dingy quarters which were lacking sanitation, which were lacking health facilities. This middle class, this business owners, they forced this lower class on one hand to live a life of misery. But on the other hand, this same middle class managed to actually do charity and help children, fallen women, and drunk men. And as if this charity and philanthropy was a kind of a national duty, and that again is a kind of a social norm. Charity or morality, these were nothing that came from within. There is no feeling in this. It was just social standards that were being conformed to. So this is another contradiction and rather hypocrisy in the Victorian age that has been witnessed, that has been recorded by historians. The next one is about sexuality and sin, and as you know, I've discussed in the previous lectures that sexuality was a very popular topic of discussion in the Victorian period. I mean, sorry, it was not a popular topic of discussion. Like Victorian sexuality is one popular topic of discussion when it comes to the Victorian age, and Victorians were not supposed to talk about sexuality or anything related to it in public, and it was only followed that there should be no sexual overabundance in Victorian life, and they only believed in sexuality when it comes to marriage and matrimony. So on one hand, there was also a double standard that was there in Victorian society, because on one hand you are supposed to involve yourself in the heterosexual monogamy that was popular in Victorian age, but on the other hand there was these red light district and red light zones that flourished in city after city, and there were very popular houses of prostitution, gambling dens, and all sorts of vices that were rampant in these districts. And what is very surprising is that law and the police just turned a kind of blind eye to them. And this was the double standards that were there in Victorian society. Now this was once again gendered, because as I've told you in the previous lecture, now this whole burden of sexual morality was more heavily put on the women, and men often sneaked out to these prostitute houses, to these prostitute areas, these red light district, and women were supposed to be very true to their relationship in marriage, and they were supposed to practice chastity before marriage, and once they were married they were supposed to maintain this monogamy and be faithful in the relationship. So this is once again gendered. And when it comes to sin, I've told you that there was no tolerance of crimes and sin in Victorian area. Everyone was expected to abide by the law and the legal system. Now there was compromise in this too, because as we can see that sins and vices in Victorian society were actually tolerated so long as they took place in the private sphere inside the house, and that was to respect the reputation of these respectable men and women who actually deviated from the official system. And it was fine, it was tolerated, and it was absolutely fine as long as you break these laws inside your house and not in the public sphere, because if you do this in the public sphere, then your reputation will be at question. So you can do anything inside the house, and when you come out in the public sphere, then you be the respectable citizen again, which you are expected to be. So this is again a contradiction that was there in Victorian society. Now we'll see what reflection it has in the two poems we have. The first one is Tennyson's Ulysses. Now I didn't quote any line, because the reflection of this Victorian compromise is rather in Tennyson's approach or the theme of Ulysses. Now you can see Ulysses, there is a contradiction, there is a dichotomy between his exploration and life of action versus his domesticity and responsibility. Now as you know, this life of continuous exploration, a life of action, was something that the Victorians believed in. It was the spirit of this age. And that's exactly what Ulysses does. He says that even I am in the old age, there is still a lot of action, a lot of things that can happen in my life. Until I am alive, I will go for that exploration. So this is his attitude towards life on one hand, but on the other hand, Victorians also were expected to live by these domestic responsibilities, and you were supposed to return home, as I discussed in the previous lecture. So Ulysses as a character in Tennyson's Ulysses is somewhere torn between this life of exploration and this life of domesticity, which were completely opposite. And that is why he wants to pass on this responsibility to his son Telemachus, because he believes in that life of exploration and action. So how can both spirits, one of exploration and action and one of domesticity and staying behind for your responsibility, exist? So these two existed at the same time in the Victorian age. That is also one of the major contradiction that was there. Now another one was obviously what I discussed in the very first lecture of this series, is about this dichotomy between science and faith. And you will see that the two characters here, the old Ulysses and his son Telemachus, Ulysses is rather a representative of this new world order of science and exploration, because science believed in exploration and pushing the boundaries, and that's exactly what Ulysses is doing. He's pushing the boundaries, pushing the boundaries beyond his limits. That's what makes him this that's what contributes to this exploration, the spirit of exploration. On the other hand, tradition was about following the old world order. And Telemachus, Ulysses' son, is rather a representative of this world of tradition, and this is completely in contrast to this world of science and progress. And Telemachus, because he is following the old world order, he is following a tradition, he is more traditional, and that is why Ulysses says that he knows his duties and he can be a fit ruler, he is fit to govern this race. So this again is actually the contradiction that we find in Tennyson's Ulysses. We move on to Browning's My Last Duchess, and as I've said, that when it comes to the public sphere, there was in Victorian age, it was about law, order, and absolutely no tolerance of criminal activity when in the public sphere. But in the private sphere, sin could be tolerated, and that is why you see that the last Duchess was murdered and nothing has actually happened to the Duke, because as long as he's doing it within his house, I don't think it's a problem. And this again you find in Porphyria's Lover by the same poet. Porphyria is killed when she visits the house of this lover, and that murder too goes unpunished, because at the end of the poem, Porphyria's lover says that he has not heard from God yet. So when it came to the private sphere, sin and crimes could be tolerated. So that is one reflection of Victorian Compromise that we find in My Last Duchess. Another is probably this dichotomy between democracy and authority. Now, as you know, there were many movements, the poor laws movements, the charters movements, and many other movements that happened, that were there in Victorian period. And people say that the seeds of democracy were present in the Victorian period. So we even find some reflection of that although I'm not sure about this, it may be because it's seen in My Last Duchess that the Duchess actually is happy about these offers from that officious fool who offered her something, and she's happy about many other things, and many other people actually gives her the happiness that her husband the duke believes should only be given by him. So the duke here is a representative of that authority. This may be the Victorian authority, this may be a patriarchal authority if we see this poem through the lens of gender. So that is one another reflection that we might get in My Last Duchess. So with that, I end the six videos, like the six video lectures about social and intellectual background. Now, obviously, if you have seen all the six videos, you'd know that I have also discussed very important sections of both the poems that are in our syllabus through relating with these traits of the Victorian period. Of course, we'll do the poem separately, but I think many important issues that arise from these Victorian period are already reflected in the six lectures that I have done. So see these lectures and we'll discuss again.